The moment I walked into that conference room, 30 minutes before the biggest defense contract pitch of the year, every executive in the building suddenly remembered my name. Funny how people who spent months ignoring you suddenly discover your value when the stakes hit 8 figures. The VP of Operations actually rushed over with a stack of binders, sweating through his suit jacket, whispering urgently, "We need you to stabilize the prototype system before the colonel arrives." I didn't answer right away. I just raised the single sheet of paper in my hand, my resignation, and watched the blood drain from his face. What none of them realized was that the countdown had started weeks before this moment. It began when they hired a brand new director with a shiny MBA and zero technical understanding to streamline engineering. In reality, that meant taking credit for work he couldn't define and cutting the people who actually held the place together. I became his favorite target the moment he realized he couldn't impress anyone while I still existed in the building. He'd hover behind me during code reviews, pretending he understood the lines I wrote, and make little snide comments like, "I'm sure the younger team could modernize this if we weren't stuck with legacy talent." Legacy. That was his polite way of calling me outdated after 19 years of building the systems the government trusted. Things escalated when he started sending my work directly to clients without verifying dependencies, trying to look proactive. Twice I saved him from causing delays that would have cost the company millions. The third time, I let him walk straight into the meeting with a half-configured prototype. The embarrassment was so public he nearly choked trying to explain himself. And instead of learning from it, he doubled down and threatened my job. That was the moment I knew exactly how this story would end, and how much it would cost them. So I started quietly preparing. I documented every component of the defense-grade system we'd been developing, every integration, every security handshake, every hard-coded government requirement. I didn't hide anything or sabotage anything. I just made sure nothing could be launched without the engineer who built the architecture, me. When the director finally made his move and wrote me up for poor adaptability and failure to follow leadership direction, I accepted the paper with a smile. Because he had no idea what I already knew, the Department of Defense would not finalize the contract unless one specific engineer, the one who designed the secure integration layer, was present for the final briefing. And that engineer's name was on every document, every blueprint, every approval chain. Which brings us back to the conference room, the day of the $16 million contract. Executives pacing, phones vibrating non-stop, military reps arriving in 20 minutes, and the director pretending he wasn't panicking while breathing like he'd run a marathon. The prototype was crashing repeatedly because he had forced junior engineers to adjust parameters they didn't understand. They needed me. Not wanted. Needed. Without me, the system wouldn't sync with the encrypted endpoint, and the colonel would walk out in 5 minutes flat. The VP asked if I could just take a quick look, voice trembling. I finally spoke, calm and even, "I don't work here." His face collapsed. He tried bargaining, apologizing, flattering, all the things men like him never do until their careers are on the line. Then came the desperation. "We'll undo the write-up. We'll reset your performance review. We'll even discuss a title change." The director stood behind him, red-faced, silent, knowing the consequences of his arrogance were about to fall squarely on him. I folded my resignation paper once, placed it neatly on the table, and said, "I gave you warnings. You ignored every one." Then I stepped aside as the colonel entered the room and immediately asked, "Where's the systems architect? We can't proceed without him." The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. The presentation crashed twice within the first 7 minutes. The colonel's expression shifted from curious to irritated to done. When he closed the binder and said, "If your engineering team isn't present, neither are we," the executives practically melted into their chairs. The defense team stood up and left the conference room without waiting for a response. That was it. 14 months of development, gone in under 10 minutes. I walked out of the building before the shouting started, before panic spread through the hallways, before anyone could grab my arm and beg one last time. I didn't need to see any of it. The resignation letter did its job. I got into my car, turned the key, and felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. I was halfway home when my phone started exploding with messages, not texts, paragraphs. The CFO called twice, the COO left a voicemail that sounded one breath away from tears, and the VP who had dismissed my concerns for months wrote, "Please, we can fix this if you come back. The director has been removed." Removed. A polite corporate word for sacrificed at the altar of panic. But I didn't. I didn't need to. The damage was done long before the colonel walked into that room. They made their choice when they decided I was replaceable. The universe simply made them live with it. The next morning, while the company scrambled to assemble a recovery task force, the news spread through the building. The Department of Defense had awarded the contract to a competitor, a smaller firm whose lead architect, as fate would have it, was an old mentor of mine. He texted me a single line: "Your former company says thanks for the referral." I laughed for a solid minute. Meanwhile, the fallout only got worse. The board demanded explanations, and the director, now jobless, pointed fingers at everyone except himself. The executives tried framing it as a miscommunication, but the DoD wasn't interested in excuses. They issued a formal notice stating the company had demonstrated insufficient technical readiness and structural instability. That language was brutal, the kind that sticks to a company's record for years. Morale inside the building cratered. I heard from former colleagues that half the team wanted to resign within weeks. The junior engineers who'd been forced to make unauthorized changes were finally being listened to, but only because leadership needed scapegoats. The VP of operations was demoted. The CTO stepped back for health reasons, which everyone knew was code for being pushed out. And me? I slept better than I had in years. The irony is that my revenge didn't require sabotage, pettiness, or anything underhanded. It only required the truth that they refused to accept until it cost them $16 million in a federal black mark that would follow them for the rest of their careers. A month later, I joined another firm, one that actually valued experience over optics, architecture over ego, and respect over titles. During my first week, the CEO personally introduced me to the team and said, "This is the guy who keeps systems from collapsing." I didn't flinch. I just nodded. Because she was right. And sometimes, that's all corporate revenge really is: not fire, not destruction, not chaos. Just watching a company finally understand the price of underestimating the wrong engineer. In the end, they held the meeting. They held the presentation. They held the contract proposal. But I held the resignation. And that was the one document they couldn't recover from. Even after I moved on, the ripples kept spreading, because a corporate disaster that size doesn't just vanish. It leaks. It stains. It leaves fingerprints on every hallway conversation and every investor update. 3 weeks after I started my new job, I got coffee with Jenna, one of the bright systems analysts who used to report to me. She looked tired. That hollow, stretched thin expression you see on people who've been living in urgent mode for too long. "They brought in outside consultants," she said, stirring her coffee without really looking at it. 3 of them. Each costing more per month than you made in 6. And guess what their first recommendation was? I smirked. Rewind 6 months and listen to the damn architect? She gave me that sad, knowing smile. Exactly. They were redoing the entire infrastructure blueprint, the same one I designed, the same one my director butchered to speed up delivery. Now they were rebuilding it from scratch because the consultants confirmed what I'd been shouting into the void: the original architecture was the only stable long-term option. Meanwhile, headquarters turned into a revolving door. The project manager who'd helped push unrealistic timelines quit after the board grilled him. The VP tried to spin the loss as a valuable learning experience, but shareholders didn't buy it. They wanted accountability. And accountability, in corporate terms, means heads rolling. By mid-quarter, 5 major roles had been eliminated or replaced. The director, the one who stripped away the safety protocols and told me to be a team player, was blacklisted from defense contracting for the foreseeable future. The DoD doesn't forget. They don't forgive. And they absolutely don't let incompetence slide. The funniest part came from an unexpected place, LinkedIn. One morning, a post from the company popped up in my feed. A forced smile group photo with the caption, "Resilience defines us." The comments were a graveyard of polite corporate pity. Even my mentor commented something diplomatic that translated roughly to, "You did this to yourselves." I clicked off with a quiet, satisfied exhale. Because the truth was simple, they had spent months acting as if my warnings were obstacles instead of guidance. They had believed speed mattered more than stability, ego more than expertise. And when their empire cracked, they finally understood the cost of burying the one person who knew how to keep the walls standing. And while all that chaos brewed behind glass office doors, I was thriving. My new team treated me like a seasoned strategist, not a disposable technician. My ideas were heard, documented, and implemented without politics choking them. My manager actually asked me, "What pace works best for you?" A sentence I had never heard in my previous 5 years. Within a month, I was leading a multi-million-dollar architecture initiative, the right way. Clean. Stable. Respect-based. No ego-driven shortcuts, no director breathing down my neck with buzzwords he barely understood. One night, as I wrapped up a design review, I caught myself smiling at the screen. A real, unforced smile. I didn't destroy my last company. I didn't sabotage anything. I simply stepped away and let the weight of their own decisions crush them. And that, ironically, was the most effective revenge of all. Sometimes the universe doesn't need you to burn the bridge. It lights the match itself, and all you have to do is walk across to something better. A few months later, the full aftermath finally reached me, and it wrapped the whole story with a cleaner sense of justice than anything I could have engineered myself. I was at a defense industry networking event, making small talk over lukewarm appetizers, when an older program officer approached me with that familiar "I know you from somewhere" look. "You're the systems architect they ignored, right?" he said, lowering his voice like we were discussing classified intel. I blinked. "Word travels that far?" "Oh, farther," he chuckled grimly. "Your former company tried to blame the contract collapse on unforeseen technical failures. But during review, your documentation told a very different story." My documentation. The same documentation they tried to dismiss as overly cautious. The one they insisted was unnecessary because their timeline didn't allow for all those safeguards. Turns out, the review committee combed through every version file in the internal repository. They saw where I'd flagged stability risks. They saw the rollback procedures I'd proposed. They saw the approval trail, including the one where leadership rejected every mitigation step in the name of agility. The officer shook his head, half impressed, half disappointed. "You saved yourself a career's worth of headaches by leaving when you did." That night, on the drive home, I finally allowed the whole thing to settle. The anger. The exhaustion. The frustration of being treated like a disposable part in a machine I had practically built from scratch. I realized something powerful. What I had taken as personal failure, not being able to make them listen, was actually proof of how dysfunctional they were. You can't save a structure when the people at the top are pulling out beams to make room for their egos. The true turning point came a week later, though. Jenna messaged me, "They're shutting down the division. Entire defense R&D branch. Gone." I sat back and just stared at the screen. That division had once been their crown jewel. Their bragging rights. Their pipeline for long-term government contracts. Losing one deal hurt them, but losing credibility was the real fatal wound. No defense partner trusted them anymore. No contractor wanted to risk being tied to a firm with a reputation for ignoring experts and cutting corners. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was natural consequence. And in the background of all that collapse, my life kept rising. My new team promoted me into an advisory role on a multi-agency project, something my old director would have insisted I wasn't senior enough to touch. Meanwhile, recruiters from 2 other firms reached out after hearing what happened. I guess the industry had quietly decided I was the kind of architect you listen to, not the kind you discard. One late evening, after wrapping a design sprint, I looked out the office window at the city lights, calm, steady, exactly how a system should be when built right. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years: relief. Freedom. Validation. My old company had treated me like I was replaceable. But here's the truth they learned far too late: when you throw away the person who understands how everything works, you're not removing a cog, you're removing the blueprint. And without the blueprint, the whole machine eventually grinds itself into dust. I didn't need to sabotage them. I didn't need to get revenge. All I had to do was step aside and let their arrogance finish the job. A few more weeks passed before the final chapter of their collapse found its way to me, and it arrived in the most unexpected form: a certified envelope stamped with the company's logo, looking tired and worn, like it had survived something traumatic on the way over. Inside was a letter from their legal department. Not a threat. Not a cease and desist. Not even a plea. It was a notice. They were declaring bankruptcy. The entire corporation. Not just the division, not just the project, the whole machine had crumbled. Every department, every contract, every line of business was being liquidated. And tucked at the bottom, in the coldest corporate tone imaginable, was a line that almost made me laugh: "We regret that circumstances have forced these outcomes." Circumstances. That was their word for it. Not decisions. Not negligence. Not the relentless arrogance that led them to ignore every warning I raised. No, circumstances. It's always circumstances when the people in charge can't bear to admit their own fingerprints are on the detonation switch. But the letter wasn't the part that hit me hardest. It was what came next. 2 days later, my phone rang, an unknown number from Washington. For a second I wondered if I'd accidentally parked in the wrong zone and was about to get lectured by some federal extension. But when I picked up, a calm, authoritative voice said, "Mr. Daniels, this is Deputy Director Reeves from Defense Systems Oversight. I wanted to thank you personally." I froze. People in positions like his do not make casual courtesy calls. He continued, "Your internal documentation, your version proposals, risk assessments, and mitigation outlines prevented us from blacklisting every engineer who ever worked with that company. It proved the failure was not technical. It was managerial." A pause. "You saved a lot of careers." I didn't know what to say. I had spent months believing I walked away from a disaster I couldn't stop. Now I was being told that walking away actually protected dozens of other people who had nothing to do with the director's incompetence. Then he added something I'll never forget: "We need people like you in this industry, people who don't bend just because someone at the top wants things faster. If you're open to future advisory roles, reach out." When the call ended, I sat there, staring at the quiet room around me. It felt surreal, like the world had shifted a few degrees without telling me. My old company had sabotaged itself into oblivion. And I had unintentionally helped shield everyone else who didn't deserve to go down with it. The irony was sharp. They fired me because they thought I was a barrier. But the truth was, I had been the only thing holding the entire operation together. As months passed, the industry whispered. My name started popping up in circles I never had access to before, not because of drama, but because of clarity. Because the people who mattered could distinguish the source of a failure from the one who tried to prevent it. Meanwhile, the director, the one who shoved me out the door, couldn't land a job. Every interview looped back to the same question: if your architect warned you about structural risks, why did you proceed anyway? There was no good answer. And as their world faded, mine only expanded. New opportunities. New respect. A career trajectory that wasn't just healing, it was flourishing. One evening, I found myself looking over the city again, watching quiet roads glow like circuitry. It hit me then: revenge doesn't always come from action. Sometimes it comes from truth finally being seen. Their downfall wasn't my victory. My victory was what came after: clarity. Recognition. A future no one could take from me again. In the end, walking away hadn't cost me anything. But firing me? That decision cost them everything: $16 million, their reputation, their contracts, their company. And eventually, their entire place in the industry. All because they thought I was replaceable. What surprised me most was how long the aftershocks lasted. Like the collapse of that company had sent a silent signal through the entire industry: this is what happens when you ignore the one person who knows what they're doing. About 6 months later, I was speaking at a small systems architecture conference. Nothing huge, maybe 80 people in a room at the Marriott, half of them younger engineers hungry to understand why real-world systems fail so spectacularly. I walked them through stability layers, risk mapping, approval hierarchies, the unglamorous pieces of engineering that keep billion-dollar machines from eating themselves alive. Afterward, a young woman approached me, maybe mid-20s, clutching a notebook full of scribbles. "Can I ask something?" she said. "How did you know when it was time to walk away?" A simple question. But it hit harder than I expected. I took a moment before answering. "I didn't know," I said. "Not at first. I kept thinking I could fix it. That if I just worked harder, explained clearer, pushed a little more, they'd see what I was trying to protect." She nodded slowly. "But here's the truth," I continued. "You can't save a system led by people who refuse to listen. Once leadership stops respecting reality, it's already falling apart. You just haven't seen the cracks yet." She wrote that down like it was the most important sentence she'd heard all day. That night, on the flight home, I realized something I hadn't quite admitted to myself. My revenge story wasn't really a revenge story. Not in the classic sense: no sabotage, no secret backdoor code, no spiteful takedown. It was a story about boundaries. About professional self-respect. About what happens when someone finally says, "enough," and steps aside, letting the consequences land exactly where they belong. The company had fired me thinking they were removing a problem. But in reality, they removed the one person preventing disaster. And disaster doesn't need help. It's patient. It waits. It collects small bad decisions like dry kindling, until one spark turns everything to ash. A year later, I heard through the grapevine that their former CEO, the one who championed cutting corners, was trying to start a consultancy. But every pitch meeting died the moment a potential client Googled the old company. Reputations don't burn down quietly. They glow for a long, long time. Meanwhile, I had built something better: a career defined by clarity, purpose, and teams that actually valued the expertise they asked for. And as opportunities kept opening, advisory roles, invitations to speak, even a call from a defense contractor looking for a chief architect, I realized this truth: sometimes the greatest justice isn't watching a company fall apart. It's living long enough, and well enough, to see that you never needed them in the first place. They tried to break me before a $16 million deal. But all they really did was set me free, and give themselves a lesson in consequences they will never forget. What finally tied a bow on the entire saga came almost 2 years later, long after I'd stopped thinking about them, long after their downfall had settled into industry history instead of fresh gossip. I was at a major defense symposium, one of those high-security, badge and clearance events where the air feels thick with classified projects and quiet egos. I was there as a senior advisor now, a role I wouldn't have dreamed of back when I was fighting uphill battles with managers who couldn't read a risk chart if you tattooed it on their foreheads. After my panel, a man in a sharp gray suit approached me. He had the kind of presence that makes everyone else step aside, tall, composed, the unmistakable posture of someone with top-level clearance and decades of authority behind him. "Mr. Daniels," he said, offering a hand. "I've been wanting to meet you." I recognized the name on his badge instantly. He wasn't just anyone. He was one of the senior procurement officials responsible for approving long-term, high-value defense contracts, the kind of man my old company would have sold its soul to impress. We shook hands, and he got straight to it. "You probably don't know this," he said, "but your resignation letter ended up becoming a case study." I stared. A case study in what? He gave a slow, knowing smile. In what happens when leadership ignores critical expertise and fails to protect structural integrity. Your documentation and the timing of your exit were used internally to rewrite contractor evaluation standards. I blinked. "Wait, what?" He nodded. Contractors are now required to show how they retain specialized talent and how they escalate internal disagreements about system risks. Your situation exposed gaps we didn't realize existed. I had to take a breath. My resignation, the one they mocked, the one they said would barely be a blip, had influenced federal contracting policy. He continued, "Frankly, the collapse of that project became a turning point. We tell new program officers, if an architect waves a red flag, listen. If they walk out, stop everything." For a moment, I didn't say anything. It's strange when life folds back on itself, when something painful, humiliating even, becomes part of a larger correction that protects thousands of others you'll never meet. The official looked me in the eye. "You did more good than you realize." And then he walked off to join a conversation with generals and analysts, leaving me standing there, processing the weight of what he'd just told me. On the flight home, I found myself thinking about those days, the stress, the frustration, the meetings where I was treated as an inconvenience instead of an expert. I remembered the director rolling his eyes, the VP pushing impossible timelines, the CEO calling my concerns overcomplication. I remembered how small they made me feel. And how big the consequences were once I left. Here's the truth I finally accepted: my revenge wasn't the collapse of their company. My revenge was that the industry learned from their failure, and my name became tied to the lesson. Every time a company now pauses to reevaluate risks. Every time a manager hesitates before dismissing an architect's warning. Every time a contractor chooses integrity over speed. A small part of that shift traces back to the moment I set my resignation down on a conference table and walked out of a building already cracking under its own arrogance. I didn't burn their house down. I just refused to hold it up anymore. And the world, quietly, steadily, made sure the right people saw exactly what happened when I let go. The surprising thing about moving forward is that life rarely lets you shut a door completely. You can walk away, you can heal, you can even thrive, but every now and then, something circles back to remind you of who you were and how far you've come. That moment came for me on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was in my new office, a quiet, sunlit space overlooking a skyline I still couldn't believe I was part of, reviewing a proposal when my assistant buzzed in. "There's someone here who insists on seeing you," she said. "He won't give his name." Annoying, but not unheard of. I told her to send him in. The door opened, and for a second, I genuinely thought my mind was messing with me. It was him. My old CEO. The same man who had brushed off my reports, sidelined my decisions, and promoted incompetence into leadership because nepotism mattered more to him than expertise. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, just deflated. Like someone had drained the arrogance right out of him. He closed the door behind him. Didn't sit. Didn't smile. "Daniels," he said, voice rougher than I remembered. "I need a moment." I leaned back, calm. "I didn't know you were still in the industry." His jaw tightened. "I'm not." And there it was, the truth he never would have admitted when he was sitting on a throne built out of borrowed pride. "I'm consulting," he said. That word, consulting, told me everything. It's what people say when they're between jobs but don't want to say they're between jobs. "How can I help you?" I asked. He exhaled, long and heavy, like he'd been rehearsing this conversation and still wasn't ready for it. "I came to apologize." I sat up. Of all the things he could have said, that was not one I expected. He went on, "I ruined a good thing. I should have listened to you. I should have protected you instead of," he gestured vaguely, shame pulling at his features. "Instead of letting politics run the place." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He kept going. "When the board investigated what happened, after everything fell apart, your name came up. A lot. Everyone kept asking why we ignored your reports. Why we dismissed your projections. Why we let you walk out." His voice cracked right at the edge of frustration and regret. "The truth is, I didn't think you'd leave. I thought you'd just keep handling things like you always did. I didn't think you'd actually walk." That was the problem in one sentence. They believed I needed them more than they needed me. When he finally looked up, his eyes had none of the superiority I remembered. Just exhaustion. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said quietly. "I just needed you to know that. I know I was wrong. I know what I cost you. And what I cost the company." For a moment, the room was silent except for his shaky breath. I could have lashed out. I could have thrown his failures back at him. I could have savored the moment and made him squirm. But revenge isn't about cruelty. Revenge is about the balance of truth finally tipping into the open. So I stood, walked to the window, and spoke without anger or softness, just clarity. "You didn't cost me anything," I said. "Leaving your company was the best decision I ever made. My career didn't fall apart, it expanded. I built something you couldn't see because you were too busy protecting the wrong people." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. "And you?" I asked. "What did you gain?" He swallowed. "Perspective." I turned back to him. "Then maybe we both walked away with what we needed." He left without another word, quietly, humbly, almost gratefully, closing the door behind him like a man trying not to disturb a life that had outgrown him. And as I stood there in the sunlight, looking out over a city that had given me more than I ever expected, I realized something important. Vindication isn't loud. Sometimes it walks into your office, apologizes, and leaves. And you don't feel triumph. You feel closure. He never came back after that, and honestly, he didn't need to. His visit wasn't about rebuilding a bridge or asking for another chance. It was the final, quiet acknowledgement of a truth he'd spent years refusing to see. I wasn't replaceable. I never had been. His company didn't crumble because I left, it crumbled because he believed losing me wouldn't matter. And standing there in my own office, with my own team, my own authority, and a future that had nothing to do with his approval, I finally understood something I wish I'd realized earlier. Walking away wasn't the revenge. Becoming everything they underestimated was. The $16 million contract they lost, the board investigation, the collapse of their credibility, all of that was just gravity catching up to the choices they made. Not punishment. Not spite. Just consequences. My life moved forward. Theirs stalled. And the world drew its own conclusions. As I closed the blinds that evening and packed up for the day, I felt no anger, no lingering bitterness, just gratitude that I'd trusted myself enough to step out when staying would have shrunk me. Revenge is a story people love to tell. But the real lesson? Success that doesn't need an audience is the sharpest ending of all.